All right, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday for Carnival. All right. For those of you who are undergrads here at CMU, you realize how meaningful that is. For those of you who have just been here since the ETC, you're like, Carnival, what the? I don't get it. But it is a big event here at CMU, and one of the big things they do is they have these award ceremonies. This is the second year, and Neil Druckmann, ETC 05?
ETC 05, yes.
ETC 05 is winning a Tartans on a Rise this year. So welcome, Neil Druckmann. First time back. Now, I promise not to do anything embarrassing, Neil, but our first question was, we tried to give you an awards first, and you never came. And now CMU's giving you an award, and that gets you back? No, just joking. We love that you're here.
I'll come back for all the awards, so.
And Neil and I kind of talked, one of the things we'd love to do, and I'd like to let you know, we're taking all questions through Slido, because we have a lot of people on stream as well, so that kind of evens the field for everybody. So if you would like to submit a question, it's the information's right up there. Go to slido.com, etc_2023, and you can throw your questions in. We'll be writing those questions so we can pass them on as we go, but we're really just going to try to have a nice conversation kind of about Neil's time here at the ETC to what's going on nowadays, where all of a sudden he's doing crazy stuff like making TV shows with zombies and Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, which is what he pictured while he was here as a student. So he really was laser focused on his career while he was here as a student. Everything came out just like you planned, right?
It's still working towards that final goal.
Oh, we'll talk about that then. All right, so one of the things I thought I'd start with, as a student you came here, well, let's start before you were a student. Let's get to the important stuff everybody cares about. Conkers Bad Fur Day.
Oh, God.
Can you tell me more about that?
Conkers Bad Fur Day was an interesting game that Nintendo put out. They were trying to make an adult game that, it's an M-rated cartoon squirrel game that, as part of their promotion, I assume this is why you're asking me this, is trying to embarrass me, they teamed up with Playboy, and they went on a college tour to promote the game where they had like a competition. There's a multiplayer component to this game. And they came by Florida State University, where I was getting my undergrad in computer science. And my roommate came in and was like, they're doing like this game that you're playing all the time on the N64, they're having at the local bar, they're doing like a coming out, and I thought he was full of shit. So I went there, and like, lo and behold, there's like a Playboy Playmate model and Nintendo logos, and they're having this contest there. So I just destroyed everybody and got first place, and got like this weird director's Playboy chair and an N60. And it's weird because the first place prize was you won an N64 and Conquer Bad Fur Day, which I already had, which is how I got first place. Anyway, that's my connection to Conquer Bad Fur Day.
So that started it all. But what's interesting, one of the things we talk about back in your day, the ETC was kind of risky. It was this new degree. It was in entertainment technology. Nobody else offered it. So we found that a lot of students were coming here were willing to take the risk. Now, because of alums like you, there's this network of people who realize the ETC feels more like a safe bet. It's like, oh, I can come to the ETC. It's got a really strong curriculum, a great history. And people are like, I'm coming here because that'll lead me to a successful career, like people like yourself. But like, what could you talk about your ideas about why you thought this would be a good choice for you?
It's interesting because even back then, I don't know how many years the ETC was already around when I started in 2004. Because I had already, I knew I wanted to make games at that point. I worked for this professor, David Banks, who was really encouraging me to pursue a different program. And I looked at MIT, I looked at CMU, I looked at Georgia Tech. And I knew that people had come out of this program and got internship at EA and a bunch of other game studios.
Back then, yeah. Oh, okay.
And that's, then I came and, I went and visited all these different programs. So I came here and I talked with Don Marinelli and Randy Palish, and I interviewed with them, and they kind of like explained the program to me, and I was like, oh my God, this is the place, this is where I have to go. And I got very, very nervous, as I usually do, and just kind of put my essay together and everything, and was very excited when I got accepted.
All right, so you got accepted and you went through BVW.
And I went through BVW.
Everybody here has been through BVW.
Is it in this space? In this?
Yeah, yeah, this is the room, yeah.
Yeah.
Dave teaches it now.
BVW, it's, people talk a lot about crunch in the game industry, and there's a lot of steps being taken now to get better work-life balance. But I always tell people, the hardest I ever worked in my life was in here. I think it was like week 3 or week 4. We were like the inaugural class that used this program called Panda 3D. So we had to like figure it out, and I must have stayed up for like 3 days straight trying to program this one kind of experience. But I look back on it very fondly, and like I learned a lot, and that was what makes this place special beyond the incredible faculty you all have. Is the students, the people around you. That I never had an experience like that where I was surrounded by people so passionate about making something great and learning at the same time that it was infectious, that kind of passion that you just felt.
Yeah, I remember Randy used to say, nobody has to get a master's. So people who choose here are coming here because they want to be here,
right.
As opposed to some people at undergrad are like, well, my mom wants me to go to school. But like everybody at the ETC is sort of like, no, I want to go to the next level of something, and that's why they're choosing to be here. So also during the first semester, beyond BVW and Crunch, you took improv. That is something that we like to say internally is a very important part of our curriculum, probably like the most special part in some ways. Is that proven true for you as you've moved out beyond?
Yeah, there's a few things that have just stuck with me throughout my entire career that I kind of go back to, and improv with Brenda is definitely one of those things. It's you could tell just the way I'm talking, I'm looking down. I'm an introvert. It's the most terrifying thing in the world. Being told to like act in front of other students that you're trying to you don't know them, you're trying to impress them, and it's terrifying. But the lessons you get from it, as far as just leaning on other people, yes-anding them, collaborating. Having a goal, but understanding that how you get there can have many different paths to it. I constantly reference that, and it's maybe because it was slightly traumatic, it's like seared into my mind. But I look at it very positively.
Nice. And then the last class really is like visual story. And I think it's interesting thinking about you taking it, because back then you're like games.
Yeah.
But just recently you've made a TV show. So how across your time has that been impactful on your career?
Very much so. Ralph, I owe maybe my career to Ralph Vituccio, because he also helped advise the Night of the Living Dead project. But yeah, just all those lessons that visual storytelling, constantly apply them to games. But obviously, the next level of that, the more pure version of that, is film and TV. So those are, as well, lessons that I've learned there have been applicable throughout the entire career.
So the first semester set you up for projects, and you just mentioned George Romero. Do you mind giving him one of the projects that Neil worked on? George Romero was the client. So it had a zombie theme, and apparently there was a seed of something that The Last of Us was born in that project. Yeah.
So I assume the process is similar. When you get to projects, there are all these projects presented in front of you, as well as you could pitch projects. I was a huge horror zombie fan already. So when one of the projects was Night of the Living Dead, and to work with George Romero, I was freaking out. I was like, how do I get on that project? I don't care about any other project. I want that project. And I was told what I'm sure you all are told, like, no, you have to present a pitch for every project. You might get on it, you might not. So I'm like, I don't know if I should tell you all this, but like, how do I stack the deck? Because I just want to get on this project. So I approached all of them as told and wrote an essay and was really trying to get my mind around all the projects. But then for this other project, I went above and beyond. I'm like, I made concept art.
As an artist.
As an artist.
Right.
As an artist. But it was if you looked at all my kind of like applications for all these projects, it was very clear the one I was angling for. And I was lucky that I got on it with some good friends of mine as well, Brad Stokin, Brian Trank, a lot of people I still keep in touch with. And the first part of the project was come up with 3 game pitches that would be pitched in front of George, and then George would give feedback, and then he would pick the one that he likes the most, and that would be developed as a prototype for the whole semester. So I was trying to figure out, okay, what am I excited by? I just played this game called Eco that I loved, and I loved how it used mechanics to build an emotional connection between these two characters. I was a huge fan of Sin City, Frank Miller's comic book that had all these kind of like hard-boiled characters. So I'm like, I lifted essentially a character of Hard Again from Sin City, the mechanics of Eco, and plopped them into the world of George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, and came up with this very loose story of this guy that lost his daughter, that would have to travel across the United States with this girl that lost her parents. And got some very useful feedback. One that I remember to this day was from Jesse Schell that told me, it's like, this mechanic that you have here, this hand-holding mechanic, that's clearly Eco. So that's the thing you have to take out, because you got to make this its own. It's just like your inspiration are too obvious. And that's a bit of advice that have kind of stuck with me throughout. Refine it, worked on it, made some more art, pitched it to George, along with these other two pitches that my classmates made, or also kind of brilliant in their own ways. And George didn't like it that much because it didn't have any of his characters in it. But yeah, no, it gave some interesting feedback. But then he picked a different one of the other pitches, and that's the one we developed for the rest of the semester. But I was so intrigued with those characters and that relationship. Years later, when I was already starting to work at Naughty Dog, I was like, you know what, I just really like this story. I was like, what if I developed as a comic book? So I wrote like a 6-issue series that would have been longer. I spent a year on it and did artwork and pitched it to, I only pitched it actually to Image Comics. And I got a nice letter from their publisher, Eric Larson, that I actually admire, and did this comic book called The Savage Dragon. And politely says why it doesn't work for them. They were already making like Walking Dead and didn't like my artwork at all, understandably. So I shelved it, and then there was a point at Naughty Dog where there was a chance to pitch a new project. So I dusted this script off, and I was like, what if we did this? And it got enough people excited that we started developing it, and eventually that turned into The Last of Us.
All George Romero's fault.
All George.
So that was one project. And one of the things we talk about a lot in terms of projects are the learning comes from the challenges, whether it's the client or working with a team that you're struggling with, or the faculty are giving you too much conflicting feedback. How do you feel like the George Romero project went? Was it just easy peasy, or did you have challenges?
No, it was...
Or was it a mess?
It was a complete mess. We were overly ambitious. The idea we had was really cool, which was that you'd be stuck in this house with characters from Night of the Living Dead, and you would form these dynamic relationships, almost like we looked at mechanics like The Sims or something, so there'd be bars of how you form, and based on how close you are, how much people trusted you as a leader, they would behave differently in the house. No way you could pull it off in a semester. Like, that would be like an ambitious AAA project, let alone a semester prototype, that we didn't even come close to pulling off our ideas. Right, so you just learn a lot of lessons about scope, about how we learn people, and then at the end, Ralph kind of saved us as he took like everything that we had, interviewed us, and we put a video together that helped kind of pitch what this would have been. But we actually didn't, while it was playable to a degree, we didn't prove out any of our concepts beyond that. So yeah, just a lot of learnings, and luckily that wasn't like a real game that we had to put out there, but it was a humbling experience.
So this gets to the idea of pitching your ideas, not only just across time from George Romero to like while you're at Naughty Dog and like towards Image Comics, but our students, is one of the big variables is they can pitch their projects. And even if you're on a project that's not pitch, you're trying to pitch your ideas to yourself or to the client or to your team. Do you have any advice on ways and strategies? You know, this is coming from the chat, just people like, how would you recommend making a good pitch?
It's a good question. There's brevity and focus. You know exactly what you're pitching. What it is and what it isn't is always important, so that you could focus on the strength. What makes this unique from anything else that might be out there? Clarity. Mystery is good. Mystery at the beginning. And these are a lot of principles that you just have for good storytelling. So I guess the other thing is like, tell a story. Get people engaged. You start from something familiar and turn it into the unfamiliar. So the point I was trying to get to. Mystery is good. Confusion is bad. You want the people to understand the concept that you're trying to pitch. Are they coming across? Play test your pitch. Get other people that you're familiar with, pitch it to them, and then see first that what you're trying to convey actually come through. If they don't misunderstand, then your pitch is not working and you got to iterate on it. Then, if they are understanding, are they engaged? Is it good? These are the things you have to figure out. And like a good story, the ending is 50% of the experience. Make sure like you end in a really punchy way that gets people excited and leave them wanting more. That's what comes to mind.
Just that.
And visuals. Visuals are really good in pitches.
Like building on that, thinking about the projects and pitches and the idea of co-ops, how would you, like looking at some of the questions coming in, we feel like one of the strengths of the ETC is it's not just a game degree, or it's not just this degree. It's sort of like this more like, here's how you make creative entertainment, whether it's games, short films, and animation, theme parks. So do you find distinct, since you've had somebody who's like kind of went games and now you're in television, we have a lot of students who are interested in location-based, any advice on working, or do you have any interest in working in the physical spaces where you're building stuff? Or do you feel?
Do I have interest in that? I do.
Ooh.
Quite a bit. I don't think I could say anything right now, but.
All right. Well,
maybe I'll just tell
Tom?
Jesse about it later. But I am very much interested in that space. I recently actually got to tour this guy Scott. I'm blanking on his last name. He was one of the designers on the new Mario ride at Universal Studios. So he was able to give me a tour and kind of explain how they did it, and I got to ask him like a million questions. But I always thought if I didn't end up in games, I would want to end up at like theme parks.
And do you see sort of like some skill sets that set you apart regardless of the fields that came out of here and what you're doing now? Or do you think there's some distinct things you need for television or games or theme parks? Or
each one of those definitely has distinct skills, and I think sometimes when people fail, when they jump from one to the other, is hubris of thinking, oh, I was really successful in this space, therefore I could be successful in any space. With games, so much of it is ceding control or to the player, right? You're collaborating with the player in a way that you don't quite the same way in TV. There's also a conversation in TV between the viewer, but it's a passive experience. You're crafting it exactly of what you want people to experience. In games, when you build a space, you don't know where people are going to look, how they're going to move through it, how quickly they're going to move through it. So pacing is vastly different between gaming and TV. And now even with theme park rides, they're becoming much more interactive. So I guess that Venn diagram is kind of closing with a bunch of these, but they still very much require distinct skills.
So thinking of those skills, and I know this is something a lot of our students, like, we're week 12, some of them are graduating in a month, and some of them are looking for summer internships. Like, as you're doing these projects and working on those skills, like, what did you think the transition to trying to get that summer internship or trying to get that first job? What were some of the things that any recommendations? Like, looking back, you're like, what did I do well? Or, oh, if I only had done this.
I wish I was way less nervous about getting that summer internship. Like, as Chris Klug can vouch for, I was in his office constantly just dreading, like, not being able to get the internship. Or I was lucky enough that I had an offer from EA to be a designer on a project I wasn't that excited about, or a programmer at Naughty Dog, a place where I really wanted to be, but not the job I necessarily wanted. And the advice that Chris gave me that turned out to be very good, a very good one, was like, go where you want to be. Get through the door. You'll be surrounded by the people that you're going to want to work with and eventually maybe take over their job. And you can learn from them. And that's the most valuable part right now. The other thing is, like, EA offered me more money than Naughty Dog, and I was stressing about that. And everyone across the board gave me the same advice. Don't think about the money right now. now is not the time to worry about that. Just go where you want to be. And I find this to be true. If you do your best work and you're really passionate about it, the money part will take care of itself. And that's why I've almost never been worried about that part in my career. So there's that. I guess while you're here, I mean, the skills that are the most valuable are applicable to all these areas, which is problem solving, learning, collaborating with other people, understanding when someone is better than you at something and conceding that. Those are applicable across the board and will make you successful across the board wherever you end up. So that should be your primary focus more than the programming language you're learning or the specific 3D package, whether it's like Maya or 3D Studio Max. I don't even know if that's still a thing. Probably not.
Same company.
Those are less important. Those you could pick up along the way. And they'll, like years from now, they'll be totally different. And wherever you end up, the engine you work with will be completely different. So it's more about how quickly you could pick up new skills than the skill itself is what's important.
Mm-hmm. So what's, I think, hopefully heartening for students to hear is even Neil Druckmann was worried about getting an internship once upon a time. But it's fascinating watching from a perspective across the years as companies look for different things or there's different skill sets. So like at Naughty Dog or in the field right now, what do you think are sort of people, what are they looking for in terms of like programmers, designers, artists?
Well,
or what
I guess one other bit of advice is, sometimes you all are very talented, and I'm sure that's how you've ended up here. And you often have more than one skill set, and especially a lot of you will have probably picked up another skill set while you're here, and then you'll see like a job opening at a game studio, and when a game studio is trying to hire, they're trying to solve a problem. There's a need that they need to fulfill. And if you come to them and say, look, I'm good at like 10 things, they're like, I don't care about 9 of them. I care about 1 of them. So help them solve the problem. Focus on the one thing they're looking for and nothing else right now. Even if that's your ambition, they don't need to know that right now. Once you're through the door, then you could slowly work on changing that. So that's the other bit of advice I'd give when you're interviewing specifically.
So coming out of that interview, some questions here are like, so you started as a programmer. Did you know you wanted to be a designer right away, or what helped you know you wanted to make the switch, and then how did you sort of navigate making that switch?
I knew I wanted to be on the creative side of things more than the technical side of things. I did have a programming background, and again, I was filling a need. Like Naughty Dog historically doesn't offer internship. I managed to talk to the right person at the right time. It was Jason Rubin, who was the co-founder and co-president of Naughty Dog, while they happened to be looking for an internship, for a programming internship specifically. But I was interested in design. That was the dilemma I had, is like, because I wanted to be a designer, and that's why I got the design offer from EA, and it was very enticing. So I always knew that was my path. So when I started Naughty Dog, I was a tools programmer. So not only was I not involved in design, the programming I was doing was not even like part of the game directly. But my approach was, let me kick ass in whatever task they give me, and then befriend the designers, see what they're working on. And Naughty Dog always tries to run as lean as possible. So everyone has like a little bit more work than they probably can handle on their schedule, which means they could use the help. So when we were working on Jack 3 at the time, one, I tried to like get I was making a tool. It was called LAME. It was literally called LAME. It's like the local asset management engine. So it doesn't matter. It was a tool. I made sure that was always delivered on time, and it was great. And then in my spare time, I saw what the designers are working on, and any design task I could take, I would take. And I would work late into the hours, which, again, I don't know if that's the thing to do anymore. I realized things have changed, but that was my path. That at some point, I felt I'd done enough of that. I went to my boss, who's now my partner at the studio, Evan Wells. And I said, they had a design opening. I said, hey, I'd like to apply for this job. And he said, you don't have the right experience. You can't do it. And I said, and I tried to make the case of why I had certain things. And I got a no. We hired you to be a programmer. You're not skilled enough to do it. We're going to hire someone from the outside. And it was, it stung to hear that. But I said, okay, how about this? Because I see he felt bad as well. So what if one of the skills I asked him, he told me I was missing was I've never done level design. And he used those. And I said, okay, I feel like I could do it, but you don't know that. What if I did that in my spare time? I'll just design something, not for the game, but like as if I was designing a Jack and Daxter level. Can you just give me feedback? That's it. That's all I'm asking for. And he said, if it'll get you out of my office, sure. And I think he thought maybe I just wouldn't do it. The next day, I came, and I had like at the time we were designing everything on paper. So it was a paper map, and I showed it to him, and he said, oh, okay. And he gave me some highlights, like, it's too symmetrical, here are things I would change. Again, trying to just shoo me away. Then I took a week, and I came back, and I'm like, okay, here's all your notes addressed. Okay, and he gave me some more notes, and like, and we're thinking about moving from paper to Illustrator. And so I went and learned Illustrator, and like I came back a month later. I said, here's another map. And I did that enough, and I think, I don't know, a few months later, there was another opening, and I told him I'm interested, and he said, yes. And that's how I was able eventually to make that shift. But it took him to show, I needed to show him that I was passionate about it, and I was willing to learn all these new tools, and I could deliver. I could actually do the job. At a junior level, but I could do it. And that's eventually how I switched. So I did 2 games as a programmer, Jack 3 and Jack X. And then we were doing the title Jack for the PSP that got canceled. But I was a designer, and then eventually I became a writer on that. That's a different story. That project was canceled. So this is a fun kind of inside story. We were doing 2 projects at the same time. One of them was Project Big that became Uncharted 1. And another was Jack PSP that eventually was given to another studio to make. When that project was canceled, I got pulled into Evan's office. Like each person that was on that project got pulled into the office. It was Evan and Steven, who was his partner at the time, Stephen White. And they were told, we're canceling the project. We're moving you all onto to Uncharted, essentially. So they're telling me all the reasons why we're canceling this project, because this other project, Uncharted, is in trouble, needs more resources. We can't afford to have these 2 projects going on simultaneously. And the whole time I'm thinking, they're going to move me back to be a programmer. I'm going to go back to being a programmer. I can't handle this. And I'm just stressing out. And he's like, and we're going to move you over to Uncharted. I'm like, so what am I doing? He's like, oh, the same thing you've been doing, like design and writing, but you'll just be doing it on Uncharted. And I'm like, oh, thank God, who cares? Like, I didn't care at all that the project was canceled. As long as I was still doing what I loved, that's what mattered to me.
So like making that switch, it also feels like for you there's possibly a distinction between design and writing. How do they relate, and how are they different for you in terms of games and the work you do?
Oh, they're pretty different skill sets. I don't know if I could, like, that could be a whole talk on itself. I was just talking about their differences, but...
In 2 or 3 minutes? No,
but that was another one where that was around the time I was writing the story, The Turning, this comic book. So I was reading a lot of Robert McKee, going to story seminars. I lived at Night Dog is in LA, so I could go to story seminars. I went to like a talk by Pixar. So I was just learning a lot of just storytelling principles and writing, which I've done even in the past, but again, never to that kind of degree. So when I was working on the Jack PSP title, I had a lot of feedback as like scripts were coming in and the story was coming in. And again, the creative director, Dan Arey, at the time, who was working both on Uncharted and the PSP title, clearly his passions were more on the Uncharted. And so there was just not a lot of attention here, which was actually a really good place to be, because there's a lot of opportunity to take stuff on. So there was the game director of that project, Richard LaMarchand. And I would go to him and give him feedback on the story. I'm like, here's how we can do things better. Here's how we can make the relationships better. And I did it so much, eventually, and again, you have to be careful with this. This worked for me, but take this advice lightly, is I was a little annoying. I look back at it now, and I'm like, I could have done these things a little bit better. But at some point, he was like, okay, you think you could do it so much better? Why don't you take a pass at the script? Write the scene. And I said, okay, great. And I went and I wrote it, and I went and showed it to him. He's like, oh, that's pretty good. Okay, well, why don't you do these 3 other scenes? And I did those. And then eventually it just became like one of my tasks to do was to write those scenes. And then none of it saw the light of day. Like, again, it was all trashed when it was canceled. But it was actually really good because then I had a lot of experience. So when I came on Uncharted and I had to work with Amy Hennig, who's just a brilliant writer, I felt confident enough to be able to contribute to Uncharted 1 as a writer. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah.
I just kind of rambled for a while.
Well, I love the point you sort of made. I'd like to pull it out a little bit more of like, feels like you're very persistent when you're going after something you want, but you also are aware of like, well, I don't want to be a pest. I don't want to annoy to the point that they're kicking me out.
There is an art to that of, because you're taking up people's time. And again, when they're working on stuff, they're stressed and their time is limited. So you're trying to ask for things or ask for feedback without getting them so annoyed where they just don't want to deal with you anymore. That's where you've taken things too far.
I'm going to do a switch because a couple questions are coming up about developing your own ideas and IP. And some of you may not know, and Steve actually has a copy of this. While you were here with Alan, you made a game for the NES. Dicky Penguin. You want to say more?
There was one of the electives that you could take here was a programming for the NES, which was it's all awesome that that's a class that's offered here. So I teamed up with my ETC classmate, Alan Blomquist, who is, to this day, one of the most brilliant programmers I know. And he knew the NES inside out. He could also play Contra without ever dying, which is just a fun fact about him. So I took that class. I'm not that good of a programmer. I could not do nearly what he did. So I teamed up with him. I'm like, I'll just do the art and just help come up with the idea. So we came up with this idea called Dicky Penguin versus the Third Reich, which you play a samurai penguin fighting Nazis on a moving train. And we actually built you could download and play it. It's like a whole level has parallax scrolling. It's like a moving train, and there's like soldiers running at you that you could slice and kill them. And then you get to the end, and it's like the intro of a boss fight, and that's where the demo ends. But thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah. Steve, if you see him, he's got a copy. He's like, I should show him. He's like, oh, I think he'd. All right, so moving into your career, you've gone out of the ETC, you had an internship. He's already talked about Jack, which is what we're all here to talk about, his first games. But then you moved into, it feels like scale grew, because Uncharted were much more, both in terms of you and what you're working on, but Naughty Dog seemed to be tackling bigger, larger, like you said, it was called Project Big.
Yeah.
Like, how did that translate into not only just like workload, but the process of how you kept track of all of that as you started doing these much larger envisioned experiences?
Yeah, I remember when I started at Naughty Dog, and Christoph Balestra was my manager. He was the lead programmer, eventually became co-president of Naughty Dog, was kind of getting me a tour, and he's like, okay, here we're working on Jack 3. And I'm like, oh, cool, oh my God, I get to see a game before it comes out. Here you were, like, there's the game after that is going to be this racing game called, right now we're calling it the code name Jack X. We'll change the name later. It was never changed. That's what it shipped with, Jack X Combat Racing. And then there's this other thing called Project Big. The reason it was called Project Big is the code name for Jack and Daxter was Project Next. So they're like, when we develop new IPs, it'll be next big thing. I don't know when they decided that, but they knew that. So fun fact, the code name for Last of Us was Thing, Project Thing. So we're like, okay, next IP, we have to come up with some new paradigm. And then they showed me this demo of like this character just running around, this very realistically rendered human character. And he's like, this will be for the next generation console. I'm like, and my mind was like, whoa, I get to see next generation game before like the hardware is even announced. Like, how crazy is this? At the time, though, it was a completely different game, right? To talk about how things shift and get iterated on. It was a sci-fi open world game with like this like Art Deco look. And while we were making Jack 3 and then eventually Jack X Combat Racing, there was a small core group of people working on Project Big, and eventually it shifted to become this Indiana Jones-esque action-adventure romp that became Uncharted. And then all new tech, all new way of making things. So even like Naughty Dog at the time was known for doing very stylized, hand-keyed animation. And then the idea, I remember like it was very controversial within the studio of like, we're gonna move to motion capture and we're gonna do realistic humans. And it was a bit of a backlash. And there was almost like this uprising within the studio of people wanting to say, no, we want to stay like this like very stylized look. And that's when I remember, again, my boss, Evan, just sent out this email, like, this is not a democracy. Like, this is where the studio is heading. Like, we've all like now made this call, like, you have to get on board. Like, you have to get excited and invested in this thing. And most people did, and some didn't. Some people were like, this is not for me, and they left to go. A good friend of mine actually decided mocap wasn't for him. He was an animator, and he went to work for Blue Sky and became like a film animator. I don't know what that's just an interesting tangent, but it just like, that was like a big shift, and it feels like every kind of like generation of hardware, there are these sometimes big shifts, and like now you feel this shift in the industry of like a lot of studios are moving towards games as a live service, and that's a big paradigm shift of how you make games and how you think about them. You no longer talk about games launching or shipping. You talk about them launching. That's like that's sometimes where the game starts, is when it like comes out, and then like you really understand what it is.
And it gets weird. Like just this week or last week, they announced like Dreams is shutting down its live service. That really great game from the Sackboy Studio. I'm blanking on. But so it's hard for games as you get really invested in this game you love, and then they're like, well, we can't run it forever. Here, we're pulling the plug.
Well, that's why it's so important to have an end goal in mind, be excited about the end goal, but you have to enjoy the process, because the end goal might change, or the game might get canceled and never come out. And that's why it's so important for you to appreciate the making of it. That's the thing you have to love, more than the final thing that comes out.
Well, building, you talk a lot about passion and motivation, and one of the things we talk about on projects, and I talk to colleagues in the industry as well, is how you help motivate people to find the passion when they're not on the game. Like you were on Jack, or you were like, okay, I'll be the programmer, but my passion's over here. It's like, how do you help people find motivation? Or you're the animator who's like, no, I love the look. You know, how do you help them continue even if they're not? Like I was talking to somebody, who's like, we pay them and they still don't want to work on this game, you know. And
yeah, and then there isn't a silver bullet for that. That's sometimes it's really hard to get people excited. Like when we made The Last of Us, there were people within Naughty Dog who said, like, we don't make M-rated games. We make these like family-friendly things, and it was hard sometimes to get people excited. And you have to find the angle, and it might be like, oh, here's a part of the game you would really be excited by, or what if we change this thing? And you know, the game is malleable to some degree to get as many people excited as you can. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, and you have to commit to it, and it's going to work for a lot of people, but some people, that game didn't work for, and they left to go find other things. And that has to be okay. Jesse, I think you talk about that in your book, right? There's like getting people on board of what the thing.
thumbs up.
There's a plug for Jesse's book that you absolutely have to.
Has anybody read it? Nobody? I'm going to get a little conceptual, because you kind of gave me the opening. For Uncharted, just so you know, my wife loved watching me play it because she liked the story. And if I put it on easy, I could get through the combat pretty quickly. So that, you know, she could get the story, because sometimes she's like, oh. But somewhere in, I think, Uncharted 2, she was just like, oh my God, for, you know, the hero, you sure do kill a lot of people. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting, because Clint Hawking was talking about ludonarrative dissonance at the time. And Uncharted came as sort of like an example of that. It's like, you're this sort of lighthearted, quippy hero who kills a lot of people, but you need to like get through the mechanics. So I thought it was an interesting switch into Last of Us. I don't know if that was on your mind, because I felt like as you sort of took it out of that field into Last of Us, the sort of mechanical learning how to play the game was killing zombies, where there's sort of, all of a sudden there was less ludonarrative dissonance. And for those of you, real quick, ludonarrative dissonance means what you're having to do to play the game seems to contradict the story the game is trying to tell, possibly, in a nutshell. And so with Uncharted, it's like, oh, you're this hero who's really funny, but you sure do kill hundreds of people. But in The Last of Us, you're not killing people, you're killing a lot of, you know.
You're killing both.
Well, no, I thought like, what was fascinating is you're killing a lot of zombies to practice, but then I thought it increased the weight and impact, because when you have to kill a person, it matters more. Have to, because you do. Oh, it's evil. Anyway, sorry.
Well, with The Last of Us, you know, you are in a world where there are these groups of people trying to kill each other. So thematically, I guess that works better than, you know, Uncharted. Often people will criticize Uncharted because the tone is lighthearted. It's like, oh, he's this lighthearted, quippy guy in the cinematics, In gameplay, you're running around mowing people down. I have a bit of an issue with that argument because, you know, if you look at something like Indiana Jones, yes, he doesn't kill the same number of people, but he kills more than one person.
Right.
And that's already a lot of killing. And you're still rooting for him.
Right. You're
rooting for a murderer. But it's not our reality. Like, the Indiana Jones reality is a stylized reality. So you accept, like, death and violence doesn't mean the same as what it means in our world. And that, to me, is the approach in Uncharted. And to a lesser degree, The Last of Us is we use gameplay to give you a simulation of reality. It's a feel. The feel is more important than if you look at it objectively, like, well, you've killed 352 people. When you're playing the game, you don't think about that. It's more about, like, oh, I swung on a rope, and I dropped a grenade, and I dropped down here, and I rolled behind this thing, and, like, I rescued my ally. And then I went into cinematic, and there's this exhilaration that works, but I'll grant you that there is a shift happening both in film and in games where just the violence is taken more seriously than it did, like, for example, in the 80s. You know, if you look at action movies in the 80s, they're very different than action movies today. So I think The Last of Us, just that world, afforded less of that friction that some people might feel. But I think there is a place for it, and if you approach it thoughtfully.
Well, what I loved about Last of Us, and also was like it still like haunts me, is some of the killings are just hard. Like the things that you have to do as the protagonist.
Yeah, the Last of Us is meant to disturb you with the actions you're participating in.
Well done, check. I know, my wife was like, I can't watch this anymore. I enjoyed Uncharted, but I like finished it, the end. Anyways, not to spoil it for anybody. So building on that, all of a sudden, Last of Us became something else, a TV show. Lots of questions in here about the TV show. And like and we talked about it some at lunch, just like the differences, you know. Anything surprise you about going from games to television and trying to do sort of like an adaptation?
Yeah, by the time we were making the Last of Us TV show, we had already did some work on the Uncharted movie, even though Naughty Dog is not that involved with the movie. It's more of kind of an advisory role, consulting role. There was a period where I was working on an adaptation of The Last of Us as a film with Ghost House Production and Sam Raimi, and that was a huge learning experience, but ultimately felt that wouldn't have worked. It was just too short of a format for that story. That there was all this experience we had under our belt to do it more properly for the TV show. And the biggest learning I had on the TV show that we talked about during lunch was find a partner. And again, this is why it's important to have the humility to say, I don't know this medium as well as I do this one. There's aspects, again, that overlap that I think I could help with, but I need an expert. I need an expert that loves the material as much as we do. And that's where finding Craig Mazin, who just did Chernobyl, which I loved, and the tone of that was just spot on. And it was easy to imagine. I was like, oh man, imagine The Last of Us as a TV show with that tone. That could be really cool. And then I met Craig, and just hearing him talk about the story and his understanding of the themes of it and what we were trying to achieve with it, it became very exciting to have this partnership of like, okay, here's someone that is an expert in this other medium and loves the material and wants to partner. Like, he was looking for this collaboration, not just to take it over and make it his own thing. He wanted to remain authentic as possible. Now, authentic doesn't mean copying. I think that's a mistake sometimes adaptations make. It just means drilling down to the core principles of what made this thing kind of special, keeping those, but the surface level stuff can change wildly at times. And I guess my biggest surprise when I was on set is how familiar it all felt to make in games. It was a lot more physical. You know, when we're making a game, I don't have to worry about the weather, whether the sun is out or not, or whether it's raining. But art direction is art direction. It's just that instead of holding a controller and flying the camera around and saying, okay, how do we draw your eye more to this? I'm using my feet and walking with a crew of like artists and like pointing stuff out in real life, or like picking things up and touching them. Working with actors was the same as pacing is very different because in the TV format, you have to match, like each episode, except with a couple of exceptions, needs to fit into this kind of 1 hour mark. In games, it's way looser, and right, like the game can fluctuate wildly based on the player and what the player is doing. But I was surprised of how similar it was, and that eventually gave me the confidence to want to direct one of the episodes, which was just a fun experience. That I felt like I learned a lot of stuff from there that now I brought back to games, especially about organization. Like because film and TV have been going on for so long, they have it down to a T as far as like they could predict things and how they schedule things out and how they react to changes. There was a lot to learn about organization that we can apply at Naughty Dog.
I like the idea too. It seems like I've seen you say it in recent interviews that for your next project at Naughty Dog, you're going to have a writer's room that's more based off of television as opposed to what you used to do with your games.
Yeah, that had already started.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, to a lesser degree. So Last of Us 1, I was the sole writer. By the way, just to clarify, sole writer doesn't mean I'm not collaborating with people. Like a lot of people are pitching ideas and there's a collaboration on the story, but as far as just writing the script and dialogue and everything, that all fell to me. With Uncharted 4, I had a co-writer. And then from that point on, I've always had a co-writer. And I've really enjoyed that kind of collaboration. So that, as soon as you have one other person, in a way you have a writer's room.
Yeah, gotcha.
But with some of the new stuff we're doing, it's a more elaborate writer's room with multiple writers that are coming in with pitches, and it's structured more like a TV show. Again, not because we're trying to be more like TV, but their process as far as how they write and how they figure things out and how they break down the structure of a season is not that dissimilar to how you would break down the structure of a long-form game.
I feel Naughty Dog feels like one of the studios too that sort of exemplified having a lot of co-roles, so that like co-president, co-creative directors and stuff. Do you feel like that's a good model to have people partnering in that way and collaborating in that way?
Absolutely. And at times when I've been in positions where I didn't have that, it felt lonely in a way that could hurt could hurt yourself, just like how you're like approaching things or how insecure you might feel about them, but could also hurt the project. If there's only one person that could do something and that person gets sick, now you're just waiting. No one else can pick up that slack. So I think it's always good to have a partner there. And now what I'm realizing, is a lot of my job is mentoring the next directors and people that will eventually take over my job. It's good to partner like someone that's new and has like new ideas and passion. And sometimes a lack of understanding of something is good because you could have wild ideas that an experienced person would not because they might be more risk averse. But teaming them up with someone that's very experienced that they could learn from and kind of bounce ideas off of, that seems to be a really kind of solid combination. And right now, that's the partnership I have with my partner, Evan Wells, who's been running Naughty Dog for the past 20 years. We have the same title, co-president, but he's the senior co-president. I look to him for advice, and I let him run with things. I come up with ideas, but then we'll talk about them and discuss about how we want to move the studio forward.
Nice. So, as we get close to the hour, and just so everybody knows, Neil kind of has a hard stop, and he's disappearing to campus, so he won't have much time to gather. But I'd love to look forward and look back. In terms of looking forward, like you're saying, the studio's thinking about some things you can't talk about, but are there direction, one of the things that came up in some of the questions were the idea of a lot of games seem to revolve around combat and violence, and could we have different verbs coming into play and different metaphors, and the emotions that you were able to raise in terms of disturbance and stuff through Last of Us. Are there ways that you could see or feel challenges of could a game lead towards awe or something more very positive of an experience that pushes into new realms?
Absolutely. Those games exist already.
Yeah, I think you're right.
They just don't get made at Naughty Dog, but they do exist. But that's actually not true, because I think some of the things that made Uncharted and Last of Us special is they weren't wall-to-wall action. That a lot of AAA games, especially in the early 2000s, were just wall-to-wall action. A lot of first-person shooters, just start and end and it's shooting. And there's nothing wrong with that, except if that's the only thing that's there, that might be what's wrong with it. But I think one of the ways we were able to stand out is to have these slower-paced moments. So you brought up Uncharted 2. one of the moments that people still talk about in Uncharted 2 is, when Nate gets knocked out and you come to and you're in this village.
Yep.
And there's no guns or anything, and you're just walking around and you talk to people.
You can hold on to the cow's tail.
You talk to people that don't speak your language, very much inspired by Eco. You could go up to a yak, and when you press punch, instead of Nate punching, he pets the yak. So yes, we tend to tell more action-driven stories, but we understand that for good pacing, for good storytelling, you have to have other verbs. You have to have these other moments that makes the really action or sometimes the really violent moments stand out. Because if you're like running at 11 the whole time, nothing stands out, then it all starts falling flat.
Right. So after looking forward a little, like looking back, a lot of these people are about to go out and start their careers. Are there we talked about things you can do. Are there things you think they should avoid doing? Like pitfalls or mistakes, if you could say, oh, don't do this, it'll put you in good stead.
I could give this advice, but I know if I was given this advice, I wouldn't have taken it, which is like, don't stress out. Like, I know, especially at this moment, you're thinking about your internship, and like, I sometimes have students come up to me like, how do I become a director? I'm like, don't worry about that right now. You're not going to become, unless you start your own studio, you're not going to be a director coming out of school. So what is the discipline? What is the thing that you would you would wake up every day, be excited to work on? That's what you should be striving for, and look for the studios that hire like starting position in that field. And sometimes if they don't, you just have to do it on your spare time. Like, when I was coming out, I knew I wanted to write, but writing jobs don't come by very often. Now they do, way more than they did back then. So I wrote in my spare time because I couldn't do it as part of my job. But the things I did in my job, I really enjoyed. I don't want to steal Jesse's thunder from his talk, but he gives this last lecture in his game design course where he gets very emotional. And when I repeat it to people, I get emotional, but it stuck with me. So maybe I'll stay high level with that, which is like, know what your values are. And so for me, that has become more and more important as I've gotten kind of older, and it's like, I have more say of what we make at Naughty Dog. It's like, there's certain games I will want to do and certain games I will not want to do because I look at like the mark we leave in the world and how we want to inspire people and what is the message behind the games that we make has become more and more important to me. I don't think I'm stealing too much of your thunder when I just say that. And then just enjoy it. This goes back to the previous of don't stress out, which is, these things are hard to make. We don't always get along. Sometimes there's conflict about how we do it. And this is my new thing that I tell everybody. It's like, keep it light. We can disagree about things, and we might walk away like without getting alignment. But how do we do that without getting mad at each other, without raising our voice or anything? We just have to constantly keep it light because, again, the thing is already hard enough. It becomes impossible when it turns to if you're going home and you're stewing and you got resentment, you're doing something wrong. You still have, even when you have those fights, those arguments, you still have to enjoy it. Otherwise, you should just reassess kind of what you're doing because you can only do it for so long.
All right, I'm going to end with the question that I showed you right before, and we're like, we should end with that question. Like, what are things from the ETC that are still, what did you take forward from here that's still valuable today? Like a favorite memory or a favorite lesson that you just keep, like you obviously have things that have stuck with you from like Chris and Jesse and Ralph and Brenda.
I've mentioned some of them, right, that talk from Jesse's class, the improv acting, the individual skills, the general collaboration. I guess the other one, I was talking to Dave about this. When you do the BVW team things, at the end, you have to fill up that questionnaire about your fellow students, and you get this packet at the end of the semester. I have it to this day, and I reread it every once in a while because you think you know yourself, but you don't. So I remember getting this packet, and it had certain complimentary things about how hard I worked, but then I saw a lot of alarming things that were pretty consistent across the board, that I was not a good collaborator, that I didn't communicate. I got angry with people when I thought they didn't deliver. And I reference that often of like, that's kind of like at times my normal, and I have to be very thoughtful to not fall back into those old habits. So it's very good to recognize the things you're good at and your weaknesses, because the weaknesses is the stuff you have to constantly work on so they don't kind of crop back up. So if you get that kind of insight from your fellow students or from your faculty, that's treasure. You hang on. That's more important than the compliment, I find, is that kind of critical feedback. And you kind of hang on to that for dear life. So.
All right. Thank you, Neil. I think we're at time. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for everybody for sending questions. Really appreciate it. Now you get to go win an award.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks to everyone.